Hi everyone, I'm Rob Shapiro from Fitchburg State University, and today we're going to be talking about the BACB's 5th edition task list item G7, use shaping. So what is shaping? Shaping is the differential reinforcement of successive approximations towards a terminal desired behavior. And essentially, this requires a couple of things. It requires determining if a behavior that we're seeing is closer to the desired behavior than previous attempts were, and then reinforcing it if it is. So these two components. One is, do we have a successive approximation? Is it closer? And then if it is, making sure we provide reinforcement. So we've got these two components that are involved in shaping. The first one is that concept of differential reinforcement. And in differential reinforcement, reinforcement is delivered for responses that share some dimension or quality and is withheld for responses that do not. And that's sort of this key component in that concept of differential reinforcement is that we're different, that we're reinforcing differently. We're reinforcing some things and not reinforcing others. That's going to have a really central role in shaping. The other real key element when we're talking about shaping is that concept of successive approximations, which is basically we've got a gradual and progressive change in criterion for reinforcement, such that reinforcement is delivered for responses that more closely resemble the desired or terminal behavior. So we can think about those two words, successive and approximations. Approximations being something that is kind of like what we're looking to see. It's not quite there, but it approximates it. And then that word successive, meaning that it's progressive in nature. So the approximations at the beginning might be pretty far away from what the terminal behavior is, but then it gets successively closer to what that terminal behavior is. So we take this concept of differential reinforcement and then successive approximations and put those two together. And what we get is shaping, where in the early stages, we get an approximation that might be pretty far from what that terminal behavior is, but it's closer than anything was before it, and we provide reinforcement for that. But then, once we get an approximation that's a little bit closer to the terminal behavior, now we start to reinforce that new approximation, and we also stop reinforcing the old approximation that was a little bit farther away. So here's that differential reinforcement. It's this continuing process of both reinforcement for the new approximation and extinction of the old approximation that's farther away from the terminal behavior. There are a number of different performance dimensions that can be shaped. We can shape the topography of behavior, what it looks like. Does it look closer to the terminal behavior than previous approximations? We can shape the rate, the number of responses per unit of time. If we want behavior to happen more, we can successively reinforce a rate that approaches our terminal response. Or if we're looking for behavior to happen less, we can do it that way too. We can look for a lower rate. We can shape latency, the amount of time that elapses between the onset of a stimulus and the occurrence of the behavior. So we may be looking to decrease that latency. And in the early going, we reinforce a pretty long latency, but then over the course of time, we reinforce smaller and smaller latencies and don't reinforce longer latencies. We can shape duration, the time that's elapsed from start to finish. And again, if we're looking to build stamina, maybe we're going to progressively reinforce longer durations of behavior occurring. Or if we're looking for something to happen and be able to be finished more quickly, we could be shaping a shorter duration. We can shape interresponse time, the amount of time that elapses between one occurrence and the next occurrence. And again, depending on whether we've got a behavior that we're targeting for increase or for decrease, we may be looking to lengthen or shorten our interresponse time, and we can shape that as well. And then finally, we can shape magnitude, which could be the strength or force of the response. We may want a response to occur more forcefully or less forcefully. Like, for example, we can think about social behavior and the volume that someone engages in a social interaction. Maybe someone who's very shy is being very quiet at first, but before they wouldn't engage in any social interaction, so we reinforce that very quiet attempt. But over the course of time, we want that vocal volume to become louder and louder. So lots of different dimensions that we can shape. There are a number of guidelines for shaping so that we make sure that we use it effectively. The first is to actually select the terminal behavior. Ultimately, what is the performance that we're looking for? Right? What does that behavior actually look like when we say, yes, that's it, we've arrived? We want to define it precisely, both so that we know it when it occurs, we know that we're seeing it, but also so that we can identify successive approximations and we can sort of anticipate what they might look like. On a related level, we want to determine the criterion for success. So it's great that we know what the terminal behavior looks like, but to what degree do we need it to occur? Again, so that we know when we've reached that terminal behavior at a sufficient criterion for success. Next, we want to assess the actual response repertoire that the learner currently has. And this does a couple of things for us. Number one, it lets us determine if there actually is a gap. Maybe the learner actually already has that terminal behavior in their repertoire, in which case there's certainly no need for a shaping procedure. But assuming that we find that there is a gap between what's in the learner's repertoire and what the terminal behavior is, it lets us determine what likely early approximations are that we can then reinforce, right? If we know what a learner can currently do, we can start to anticipate as they're getting closer to the terminal behavior, what might those early attempts look like? So we can be on the lookout for them and make sure that we reinforce them. And then again, identify behaviors to be reinforced, these behaviors that are likely to occur so that reinforcement can be delivered. We also want to make sure that we eliminate interfering or extraneous stimuli so that we can maximize focus, and salience. And this actually can go for both our learners and for ourselves, right? We want to make sure that our learner is able to be focused, they're able to attend to what they need to attend to, so they're likely to engage in some of these approximations. But we also want to make sure that we, as agents of change, are in a position where we are able to focus on our learner, make sure that we see a successive approximation when it occurs so that we can reinforce it and we don't accidentally miss it. We want to proceed gradually with shaping to avoid inadvertently placing successive approximations on extinction. If we set the bar too high and we expect large shifts in topography, we may not get those from our learner. And as a result, we may take smaller successive approximations that are occurring and not reinforce them because we're looking for something bigger. And that actually can have a negative effect. It can end up placing that behavior on extinction and not have us moving closer to the terminal behavior at all. On the flip side, we may want to limit the number of approximations at each level. And this is really about efficiency. You know, we've got this process of differential reinforcement of successive approximations. That does mean that at some point we have to stop reinforcing the current approximation in the name of being able to reinforce approximations that are closer to the terminal behavior. So we really need to think about, okay, now we've established something that's closer, that's our new baseline. It's time to stop reinforcing that and reinforce something that's a little bit closer. And then we want to continue to reinforce even when the terminal behavior is achieved, right? When we've achieved that terminal behavior and our successive approximation now actually is the target behavior we're looking at, we still want to continue to reinforce that as well. But then we do want to have a plan for how we're going to shift to naturally occurring contingencies so we don't need to have contrived reinforcement in place indefinitely. So there are some benefits, but also some limitations to using shaping procedures. On the benefit side, shaping tends to be a positive skill building, reinforcement based approach. It's really based on providing lots of reinforcement for skills that are either in someone's repertoire already or are very likely to be engaged in at an early level, and to be able to provide that reinforcement on an ongoing basis rather than expecting terminal performance right away and maybe having a situation where a learner is not likely to be contacting reinforcement. And it's a systematic approach to building repertoires. It's clear, it's step by step. It's can be done in a very systematic way that we're looking for those successive approximations and being able to provide that reinforcement. But some limitations to shaping. Number one, it can be time consuming because we're not just reinforcing the terminal behavior. There could be lots of successive approximations that we end up having to reinforce. And if we linger too long at any one level, that's going to make this take an increased amount of time. Second limitation, or just a warning, is that progress isn't always linear. We could have a situation where a learner is making progress and is engaging in successive approximations, and then maybe stops and starts engaging in some behavior that's a little bit farther away, that we're at the point that we'd like to be able to place on extinction, and we may have to backtrack and start to build again and build slowly. So we just want to be aware that progress may not always be linear. And shaping requires continuous monitoring, so it's pretty effortful on the part of the behavior change agent. If we're not watching what the learner is doing, we may miss some of those successive approximations that we have to be able to provide reinforcement for if we expect shaping to be able to be effective. So there are some strategies. First of all, what shaping is, as well as some strategies for using it effectively, as well as some benefits and limitations to using shaping.